When you least expect it, life has a way of throwing you into situations that feel so unreal, so beyond anything you could have imagined, that even your closest friends can't decide whether to congratulate you or shake their heads in disbelief. It all started quietly, without drama, without warning, just a growing closeness that you never thought would turn into something bigger, and yet here you are, standing in the middle of whispers and sideways glances, because someone has decided they want to marry you, and while love itself should be celebrated, what has left everyone's jaw dropping is the age gap that separates you two. A gap so wide in the eyes of others that they call it shocking. Strange, controversial, but in your heart it feels only natural. You didn't wake up one morning and say, "Yes, this is the person I will love against all odds." It wasn't something you planned, and yet the moments kept adding up, the conversations grew longer, the silences more meaningful, and before you knew it, the bond was sealed without either of you asking for permission from the world outside. People look at you and then at them, calculating years in their minds, comparing, judging, murmuring, sometimes even laughing, but they don't see the countless times you both stayed up at night listening to each other's fears, the countless times you shared stories of pain and joy, the countless times you felt seen, heard, and valued like never before. That's the truth of it. Sometimes love doesn't arrive wrapped neatly in what society deems acceptable. Sometimes it comes wrapped in difference, wrapped in challenge, wrapped in a gap that others cannot cross but you both can leap across without hesitation. You remember the first moment it clicked for you, the exact instant when their eyes met yours and you felt that strange mixture of warmth and electricity. It wasn't about youth or maturity, not about wrinkles or smooth skin, not about the number of candles on a birthday cake, but about something far deeper, an energy that pulled you in and refused to let go. Everyone else, however, doesn't understand. And maybe they never will. You hear their words, "It's wrong, it's odd, it won't last, what will people say, what will families say, don't you think you'll regret it?" They bombard you with doubts, but none of them lived through the moments that built this connection. They weren't there when you laughed together until tears ran down your cheeks. They weren't there when you sat in silence, holding hands, saying nothing and yet saying everything. They weren't there when loneliness was replaced by companionship so profound that it felt like breathing fresh air after years of suffocation. That is what makes the difference, the secret only the two of you know. Love feels right, even if the numbers don't. You've had to ask yourself hard questions, too. Are you ready for the judgment, for the whispers, for the stares that follow you into restaurants and shops? Are you ready to defend your choice, to stand tall in front of those who mock? Because this isn't just about affection anymore, it's about commitment, about marriage, about saying to the world, "Yes, I choose this person, no matter what you think." And so the day came when they looked at you, with a seriousness that silenced every sound around, and said they want to marry you. They've decided, their heart is set, their life is tied to yours, and though you felt joy, you also knew what storm was waiting outside the door, the moment those words left their lips. You felt your heart pause, a strange mix of joy and fear surging through you, because deep down you always wondered if they were serious, if this bond that grew so naturally would truly take the next step. And now that they had said it, now that they had made the decision, there was no room left for pretending this was something small or fleeting. They wanted marriage, a life together, something permanent in a world that only sees temporary shadows, and as you sat there staring at them, you realized the weight of what this meant. People would talk even more, families would interfere, strangers would speculate, friends might turn into critics, but love has its own stubbornness. It refuses to die just because the world disapproves. It clings to you, it whispers to you, it makes you braver than you thought you could be. You remember how it all began so simply, with conversations that felt effortless, with laughter that didn't need explanation, with silences that didn't feel empty. You were surprised at how much you could share, how much they understood, how every story you told seemed to find a home in their heart. And then slowly, you began to notice the differences. The years stretched between you like an invisible rope. Others pointed it out, sometimes joking, sometimes with concern, but you shrugged it off at first, telling yourself age is just a number. Yet when you reached this moment, when they told you they wanted marriage, you felt the truth of how heavy that number looked in the eyes of society. It wasn't a small gap, not something that people would overlook. It was the kind of gap that made heads turn, that made relatives frown, that made whispers spread faster than wildfire. You know, some will call you naive, others will call them selfish, still others will invent stories to explain what they cannot understand. They'll ask, is it for money? Is it for security? Is it loneliness? Is it manipulation? They'll say love cannot exist between such different stages of life, that one day you will regret it, that one day the difference will catch up to you. But those people never felt what you feel when they smile at you. When they take your hand and look at you as if you are the only soul in the universe. They never sat beside you on nights when the rest of the world forgot you, but they remembered, and they showed up, not with grand gestures, but with small, consistent acts of care that healed parts of you you didn't know were broken. You've asked yourself if love is enough, if commitment can outlast the whispers and the judgment, and every time you come back to the same answer, yes, because love this real doesn't ask permission, it doesn't care about years, it cares about truth, and the truth is, you want this too. You think about what marriage would look like, not in the eyes of others, but in the quiet reality of two lives intertwined, morning coffees, long walks, arguments and reconciliations, shared responsibilities, dreams that sometimes align and sometimes clash, but always with a promise that you'll face them together. It's not the picture-perfect fairy tale others demand, it's something raw, authentic, vulnerable, and yet that is what makes it beautiful. Still, the reality is waiting, the moment when you'll have to announce it, when you'll have to tell the people who think they know better, when you'll see their shocked faces, their disbelief, their anger, their warnings. You know it will come, and the thought tightens your chest, but you also know that love without courage is just a fragile dream. To make it real, you must be willing to face the storm. To endure the judgment, to hold each other's hands tighter than ever before. And as you sit there, looking into their eyes, realizing they are not asking, they are declaring, they've already made their choice, you feel something shift in you, a mixture of fear and defiance, because the world may not understand, but the world doesn't get to decide. The hours after that moment felt surreal, like you were moving through a dream you couldn't quite control, your thoughts racing faster than your heartbeat, replaying their words again and again in your mind. I want to marry you, a sentence so simple yet powerful enough to alter the entire course of your life. You tried to imagine the reactions, your family, your friends, the neighbors who watch everything with sharp eyes. You could almost hear their voices, some soft with disbelief, some sharp with anger, some heavy with warnings. The picture of shocked faces wouldn't leave your mind, and still, despite all the imagined chaos, you felt a strange peace settle in your chest, because deep down you knew that this was real. That this was not a passing infatuation, not a temporary distraction, but a decision that had been growing quietly in their heart and in yours too. You remember the times you both talked about the future, not directly, not naming it marriage, but skirting around it in the ways couples do when they're testing the waters, discussing where you'd want to live, the kind of home you'd like, the way you'd split responsibilities, how you'd handle money, how you'd handle family gatherings. At the time it felt like harmless daydreaming, yet now you realize it was more than that. It was preparation, an invisible path leading to this very moment. And the more you think of it, the more you understand that the only people who truly need to live with this decision are the two of you. Not the outsiders who will talk for a while and then move on to gossip about something else. But knowing this doesn't erase the fear, because the people closest to you are not strangers, they are your parents, your siblings, your lifelong friends. Their opinions cut deeper, their judgment weighs heavier, their disappointment can break pieces of your heart. You imagine telling them, their eyes widening, their voices rising, the long pauses where silence says more than words. They will ask why, they will demand explanations, they will remind you of your age, their age, the difference that stretches like a canyon. They will throw doubts at you like stones, and every word will hurt, not because you don't believe in your choice, but because you never wanted to hurt them in the process. Love, however, rarely arrives in the tidy package that pleases everyone, and maybe it's selfish, maybe it's brave, maybe it's both, but you know this love is yours to claim. And so, in that quiet moment after they spoke, you felt your voice tremble but steady enough to whisper back, yes, because denying it would mean denying your own heart. Their face lit up, relief flooding through them, joy sparking in their eyes, and in that second it didn't matter how many birthdays separated you, didn't matter how many raised eyebrows awaited, you knew you were stepping into a storm together, and that together would be the anchor. The world may never understand. But the world has never lived inside your skin, never carried your loneliness, never felt the way their presence makes you whole. That night you lay awake, staring at the ceiling, both terrified and exhilarated, knowing life would never be the same again. The following days felt like walking on a tightrope, every step careful, every thought heavy with the weight of what was coming, because saying yes in the privacy of your shared space was one thing, but stepping into the world with that yes stamped on your life was another. You tried to keep it quiet at first, tried to hold the secret close like something fragile that might shatter if exposed too soon, but love has a way of showing itself in the smallest gestures. The way you smiled at each other a little too long, the way your voices softened when speaking, the way your presence together seemed wrapped in an invisible bond, it was enough to spark whispers before you even made an announcement. You heard the murmurs, saw the curious looks, noticed the raised eyebrows, but you carried on, telling yourself it was nothing, that maybe people didn't notice as much as you thought. But deep down you knew they did, and deep down you knew that sooner or later you'd have to face the truth out loud. What struck you most during this time wasn't just your own fear but their certainty. They didn't hesitate, didn't waver, didn't second-guess the decision. When you questioned, when you voiced the worries that kept you awake, they held your hand and repeated with unshakable calm, "I've decided, and nothing can change my heart." That steadiness became your anchor, pulling you back every time your mind wandered into spirals of doubt. You admired their courage, because it wasn't just your world that would turn upside down, it was theirs too, and perhaps even more. People would judge them, call them reckless, call them foolish, call them desperate, and still, they stood tall, refusing to let the noise dictate the rhythm of their heart. And you began to wonder, isn't this what love truly is? Not the easy days when the world claps for you, but the hard days when the world turns its back, and yet you still choose each other. Nights stretched into long conversations, mapping out the future like two travelers staring at a compass, knowing the path would be rough but determined to walk it anyway. You talked about the age difference, not pretending it didn't exist, not sugarcoating it, but facing it head-on, asking hard questions about health, energy, time, even mortality. It wasn't easy, the answers weren't simple, sometimes they brought tears, sometimes silence, but in the end each conversation ended the same way, with hands clasped, with a quiet promise to take each day as it comes. The more you talked, the more you realized that the shock everyone else felt didn't matter. Because within your private world, it was no shock at all, it was the most natural thing you had ever known. You began to feel a strange strength rising in you, the kind that only love can create, making you braver than you thought you could be, preparing you for the inevitable day when your secret would no longer be secret. You could already see it in the distance, that day of revelation, that day when all the whispers would burst into voices, when the stares would turn into questions, when the judgment would fall heavy, but instead of shrinking from it, you felt yourself standing taller, ready to say yes not just to them but to the whole world. The day it finally slipped out into the open didn't arrive with trumpets or deliberate announcements. It came quietly, almost accidentally, as most life-changing moments do. A close friend noticed the way your hand lingered in theirs too long, noticed the warmth in your eyes that went beyond friendship, and before you could deny it, the words were out, "We're going to get married." You hadn't planned to say it, hadn't planned to let it be known that soon, despite everything, despite every disapproving glance, you were stepping into marriage. Silence fell heavy in that room, silence filled with disbelief, the kind that makes time slow down. You could see the calculation happening in your friend's eyes. The unspoken math of years between you, the quiet judgment that hung in the air. Then came the words you had been expecting all along, questions sharp as knives, concerns dressed as advice, disbelief coated in worry. But the age gap. How will this work? What will people say? What about your future? They spoke quickly, almost breathlessly, as if saying the words fast enough would undo your decision. You listened, your heart pounding, but you didn't flinch, because you already knew these questions would come, and you already had your answer. You said softly, but firmly, that love is not bound by numbers, that the future is never guaranteed for anyone regardless of age, that what matters is the present you've built together. Strong and unshakable. Your friends shook their head, unable to understand, unable to accept, but you felt no anger toward them, only the sad realization that people can only see from where they stand, and they hadn't walked your path. The news spread faster than you could contain it, moving from whispers to full conversations, from small circles to family gatherings, until suddenly it felt like the whole world knew. Everywhere you turned, eyes followed you, filled with shock, curiosity, sometimes even pity. You overheard the remarks, "It's not normal, it won't last, this isn't love, it's something else," and every word stung like a thorn, but beside you, their presence was like a shield. They never faltered, never let the noise seep into their heart, never once questioned the choice they had already made. Watching their strength gave you strength, reminding you again and again that this wasn't about the crowd's opinion, it was about two people daring to love in a way most would never understand. Families reacted as expected, some with anger, some with tears, some with silence that spoke volumes. You faced long talks, attempts to persuade you, to change your mind, to make you see reason. They reminded you of the gap at every turn, reminded you of their age compared to yours, of the stages of life you were in, of the possible hardships ahead. It was overwhelming at times. Exhausting to repeat yourself, to defend your heart again and again, but every time you felt like crumbling, they would reach for your hand under the table, squeeze it gently, and the world would fall quiet for just long enough for you to remember why you said yes. Because at the end of it all, love is not measured by years but by moments, and the moments you shared outweighed every warning, every disapproving glance, every whispered judgment. The hardest part wasn't the strangers or the acquaintances, it was the family dinners where conversations turned heavy, where every smile felt strained, where every question was loaded with judgment disguised as concern. Sitting at the table, you could feel the weight of 100 unspoken words pressing down on you, the clinking of cutlery louder than usual, the silence thick between every sentence. Then someone would finally ask it outright, unable to keep it in any longer. Do you really know what you're doing? And though the tone varied, sometimes sharp, sometimes soft, sometimes trembling, it always carried the same meaning. They couldn't believe that you, of all people, would choose this path. You tried explaining in every way possible, sometimes gently, sometimes firmly, sometimes with tears in your eyes, telling them this wasn't about recklessness or desperation, but about love that felt more real than anything you had ever known. Yet no matter how carefully you chose your words, they always came back to the same point, the age gap. They listed practicalities, health, time, future children, financial stability, the long years ahead, and every argument was logical, almost persuasive, and still your heart didn't waver. Because logic had nothing to do with the way you felt when they looked at you, with the way the world seemed to fade when they held your hand. You realized then that love rarely fits into tidy boxes, it rarely makes sense on paper, and maybe that's what makes it so powerful. It demands faith, not formulas. Of course, not everyone was against you. Quietly, softly, a few voices rose in support. People who saw the bond between you and recognized it for what it was. They didn't ignore the age gap, they didn't pretend it wasn't unusual, but they understood that unusual doesn't mean wrong. Those few allies became lifelines in the storm, reminding you that even if the crowd shook their heads, not every heart was closed. You clung to that support when the nights grew heavy, when doubt whispered in your ear, when exhaustion from constant judgment threatened to dim your resolve. In those moments, they would hold you close, reminding you with their steady voice, "It's us against the world, and that's enough." And somehow, it really was enough. The more resistance you faced, the more your love grew stronger. Like a flame that burns brighter when the wind tries to snuff it out. You realized that marriage, for you, wouldn't just be about love, it would be about defiance, about choosing each other boldly in a world that wanted you apart. And though the road ahead looked long and uncertain, though the gap would always be there for others to point at, you began to see it not as a weakness but as a test, a challenge that proved your love was not ordinary, but extraordinary. That thought, that realization, gave you courage. You weren't just marrying a person, you were marrying a choice, a statement, a truth that only you and they fully understood, the night before you finally told everyone officially. You couldn't sleep. The weight of the world seemed to sit on your chest, heavy and unrelenting, as if every whispered judgment, every doubtful glance, every harsh word you hadn't yet heard was already pressing down on you. You lay awake staring into the dark, wondering what tomorrow would bring, wondering if you had the strength to face what was coming. And then they turned toward you, sensing your unease even without words, and whispered, "No matter what happens, we'll stand together." Their voice was steady, unwavering, like a lighthouse in a storm, and in that moment you realized that the courage you lacked was already living inside them, ready to be shared with you. Sleep never really came. Only fragments of rest broken by dreams of arguments and tears, but morning arrived all the same, bright and merciless. As you dressed, your heart beat faster than usual, your hands trembling slightly as you prepared yourself for the conversation you could no longer avoid. Families and friends had gathered, expecting something important, though none of them truly expected what you were about to say. The air was thick with anticipation, with curiosity, with the hum of voices waiting for answers. When you finally stood, your voice wavered for a moment, but then steadied as you looked at them beside you and remembered why you were doing this. The words came out clear, ringing in the silence, "We've decided to get married." The effect was immediate, as if a stone had been dropped into still water, ripples of shock spreading across every face in the room. Some gasped, some froze in stunned silence, some immediately began to protest. The age gap, always the silent elephant in the room, now exploded into the center of the conversation. Voices rose, questions tumbled out one after another, accusations mingled with fear. "This is madness. Do you know what you're getting into? This isn't love, it's a mistake. What will people think of us, of our family?" It was overwhelming, a storm of noise, a whirlwind of disbelief, and for a moment you felt yourself shrinking under the weight of it all. But then you felt their hand find yours. Fingers lacing tightly, grounding you, reminding you of the strength you had promised each other. You lifted your head, your voice rising above the chaos, and said firmly that this was your decision, your life, your love, and nothing would change it. The room grew louder, then quieter, arguments giving way to tired sighs, disbelief softening into resignation. Some stormed out in anger, others shook their heads in sorrow, but a few stayed behind, their expressions softer, their eyes searching for understanding. You knew it wouldn't be easy, that acceptance wouldn't come overnight, but for the first time you felt the weight lift slightly, because the truth was no longer hidden. You had spoken it aloud. And though the shock was fierce, you had survived it. And beside you, they smiled, a quiet, steady smile that told you the hardest part was already behind you. In the days that followed, the echoes of that announcement lingered everywhere you went, like invisible shadows trailing behind you. Phone calls poured in, some filled with anger, some with pleading, some with silence so thick you could hear the unspoken disappointment in every breath. Friends you thought would stand by you pulled away, their absence more painful than their words could have ever been. Family members avoided eye contact, conversations turned short and stiff, gatherings became awkward. The air around you seemed charged with judgment, as if every step you took was being watched, weighed, and criticized. And yet, in the midst of that storm, you found a strange kind of freedom, because the secret was gone. And with it, the burden of hiding. You no longer had to pretend, no longer had to carefully guard your smiles or explain away your closeness. For the first time, you could walk hand in hand in the open, even if the stairs burned holes in your back. That act alone, something so simple, so ordinary for others, felt like rebellion, like victory. Each step you took together in public was a declaration that you weren't afraid, that their shock couldn't break you. Of course, the whispers followed everywhere, in cafes, in markets, on sidewalks. You could feel eyes scanning the years between you, hear hushed conversations that stopped when you walked by. Some laughed, some sneered, some pitied you. But there were also those rare souls who smiled, who nodded in quiet recognition, as if they saw what others refused to see. Those small gestures became treasures, proof that not every heart was closed. At home, behind closed doors, life took on a new rhythm. Planning a wedding became both exhilarating and terrifying. Every choice felt loaded, not just the dress, the venue, the vows, but the very act of preparing for a future so many disapproved of. You knew not everyone would come, that some chairs would remain empty, that some invitations would be declined with cold silence. But as you sat together late at night, poring over plans, imagining the day you would stand before the world as one, you realized that the empty chairs didn't matter nearly as much as the two people standing at the center of it all. Love, after all, is not measured by the size of a crowd but by the strength of two hearts willing to choose each other. And in that quiet understanding, you found peace. You knew the road ahead would not smooth out overnight, that doubts would linger, that judgment would never fully disappear. But you also knew this, every time they smiled at you, every time they whispered reassurance, every time they stood firm when the world tried to shake you, you were reminded why you had chosen this path. Because no matter how loud the voices outside grew, the silence between your hearts spoke louder. And in that silence, there was only love. As the wedding day drew nearer, the tension seemed to grow heavier, pressing down from all sides, yet strangely your bond grew stronger in the same measure. Each criticism, each doubtful word thrown your way became like a hammer striking at stone, but instead of shattering, it carved your love into something sharper, more defined, more unbreakable. You found yourself laughing with them more often, clinging to joy even in small things, because joy became your shield against the world. You laughed when relatives tried to set you up with more suitable partners. You laughed when strangers assumed you were joking, you even laughed at the absurdity of how obsessed people seemed with your choices. But beneath that laughter, you both carried the scars of judgment, wounds not always visible but always felt. There were nights you cried quietly, afraid of a future where you might lose family, afraid of being abandoned by those who had once loved you unconditionally. And there were nights they held you close, whispering promises into your ear, reminding you that even if the whole world turned its back, you'd still have each other. Slowly, you began to realize that this was what marriage truly meant, not a picture-perfect celebration filled with endless approval, but a sacred vow between two people who choose each other in the face of everything. The age gap remained the loudest topic. The one thing no one seemed able to move past. How will you handle it years from now? They asked. What about when one of you grows old faster than the other? What about when time separates you in ways you can't ignore? Their questions were sharp, heavy, and sometimes they slipped past your defenses, planting seeds of doubt. But then you remembered the truth you had learned together: time will separate everyone eventually. No love is guaranteed forever, no life is promised endless years, and the only real measure of love is how it feels right now, in the present, in the moments you're given. And right now, you were deeply, fiercely, undeniably in love. That was enough. The plans for the wedding moved forward quietly.